The dust on her dress was older than her last meal. Evangeline stood at the gate of the Thornwood Ranch, her knuckles white against the iron bars, watching the biggest house she'd ever seen shimmer in the heat. She had practiced her speech. She would beg if she had to. She would scrub floors, mend fences, anything. But when the rancher finally came, tall and silent as a thunderhead, he didn't ask about her skills. He looked at her worn face, her thin shoulders, her desperate eyes. Then he asked the one question she never expected. Can you love children that aren't yours? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The gate felt like judgment itself beneath Evangeline's trembling fingers, cold iron that separated her from everything she needed to survive. And when the rancher finally emerged from the sprawling house, she had to tilt her head back to see his face, a hard-carved thing of sharp angles and sun-weathered lines that betrayed nothing of what he thought as he looked down at her ragged dress and hollow cheeks. "I can work," she said, the words tumbling out before courage failed her. "I can cook, clean, mend, tend animals. Anything you need, sir. I don't eat much and I don't complain and I'll work from dawn till dark if you'll just—" But he held up one broad hand and she fell silent, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "Come inside," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, and he unlocked the gate without another word, turning his back on her in a way that was either complete trust or complete indifference. She couldn't tell which. She followed him up the long, dusty drive, past corrals filled with fine horses and barns that looked more solid than any house she'd ever lived in, past bunkhouses where ranch hands paused in their work to stare at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. And with every step she felt smaller, more aware of the holes in her shoes and the fact that she'd last bathed in a creek 3 days ago. The house loomed before her, 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a wide porch and real glass windows that caught the afternoon sun like promises. And when he opened the door and gestured her inside, the cool dimness hit her like a physical thing after so many weeks under the brutal sky. The interior was beautiful in a stark, unused way. Fine furniture that no one sat on, rugs that no one walked across, a grandfather clock ticking in the silence like a heartbeat in an empty chest, and she stood dripping dust onto the polished floor while he moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher. He handed her one and she took it with shaking hands, forcing herself to sip slowly, though every cell in her body screamed to gulp it down. And he watched her with those unreadable dark eyes while she drank. "My name is William Thornwood," he said finally, setting his own glass down untouched. "I own this ranch, 20,000 acres, 300 head of cattle, 40 horses, and I have more money than I know what to do with. None of which matters because I can't fix the only problem that matters." She waited, the glass clutched in both hands, and he turned to look out the window at the land stretching endlessly toward the mountains. "My wife Catherine died a year ago," he said, his voice carefully flat. "Childbirth. The baby too. And she left me with 2 daughters, Mary who's 8 and Beth who's 5, and they haven't been right since." He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. "They don't talk, not to me, not to anyone. They barely eat. They hide in their room like animals in a cave. And I've hired 4 housekeepers in the past year, and every single one has quit because they can't stand the silence, can't stand the way the girls look through them like they're ghosts." Evangeline's throat tightened because she understood that kind of grief, the kind that turned you into something less than human, something that just existed in the spaces between heartbeats. "I've tried everything," William continued, his hands gripping the windowsill. "Doctors, a minister, even brought in Catherine's sister from Kansas City, but nothing works. They're disappearing right in front of me, and I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how to reach them." He turned back to face her and she saw something raw and desperate in his expression that made him suddenly human instead of just a rich man in a big house. "I don't need a housekeeper," he said. "I need a mother, someone who will stay, who will love them not because I'm paying her but because that's what mothers do. And I know it's an impossible thing to ask a stranger, but I'm asking anyway because I'm out of options and they're out of time." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and desperate and somehow inevitable, and Evangeline felt something crack open in her chest, a place she'd kept sealed shut since the cholera took her family 8 months ago. "I had a daughter," she heard herself say, her voice thin and strange in her own ears. And a son, and a husband. We were heading west to Oregon, going to start a farm, but we never made it past Kansas. The cholera came through the wagon train like the wrath of God, and inside a week, I was the only one left. She saw him flinch, but she kept going because if he was going to offer her this impossible thing, he deserved to know what kind of broken person he was inviting into his home. Sarah was 6 and Thomas was 3, and my husband John. He died first, trying to take care of the rest of us. And then Thomas went so fast I barely had time to hold him. And Sarah, she lasted 4 days. Long enough to tell me she was scared. Long enough to make me promise I'd be okay. And I lied to her. I told her I would be, but I'm not. I'm so far from okay I can't even see it anymore. The tears came then, hot and shameful, tracking through the dust on her cheeks, and she waited for him to tell her to leave. That he needed someone whole, not someone as shattered as his daughters. But instead he just nodded slowly like she'd confirmed something he already knew. The other housekeepers, he said quietly. They were competent, professional, exactly what you'd want in an employee, and the girls hated every one of them because competence isn't what they need. They need someone who understands what it's like when the world breaks and you have to keep breathing anyway. He moved to a desk, in the corner, and pulled out a piece of paper, writing something in quick, decisive strokes. I'm offering you a room in this house, 3 meals a day, and $30 a month, he said, his pen scratching across the paper. Your only job is to be there for Mary and Beth, to sit with them, talk to them even if they don't talk back, to be a presence in their lives that doesn't give up and doesn't leave. And I'm not asking you to replace their mother because no one can do that. I'm asking you to show them that life can start again after loss. $30 a month, Evangeline thought dizzily. That was what a skilled ranch hand made. More money than she'd ever had in her life, and a room and food besides. And all she had to do was love 2 children who might never love her back. 2 little girls who were drowning in the same dark water that had been dragging her under for months. They might not accept me, she said, needing him to understand the risk. They might hate me, might see me as someone trying to take their mother's place. I know, William said, and he handed her the paper, a contract written in simple terms. Her name already filled in, though she'd never told him what it was. He must have asked someone in town who the ragged woman at his gate was. But you'll stay anyway. That's the job. You'll stay when it's hard and when it seems hopeless and when they push you away. Because that's what family does. They stay. Evangeline looked down at the contract, at her name written in his strong, angular hand, Evangeline Rose Morrison, and she thought about the alternative, about the empty roads and the hunger and the slow, grinding process of giving up that had been eating away at her for months. And she thought about 2 little girls locked in the same darkness she knew too well. And she thought about how maybe, just maybe, they could all find a way out together. I'll stay, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months, and she took the pen from his hand and signed her name below his, the scratch of it final and binding as a vow. William nodded once, sharp and satisfied, and he folded the paper and put it in his desk drawer like it was something precious. The girls are upstairs, he said. Second door on the left. They've been in their room since breakfast. I'll take you up and introduce you, but don't expect much. They haven't said a word to anyone in 3 weeks. They climbed the wide staircase together, her worn boots silent on the thick carpet runner, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and windows that looked out on an empire of grass and sky, and with each step Evangeline felt the weight of what she'd agreed to, settling onto her shoulders like a yoke, heavy but not unwelcome because at least it was purpose, at least it was something other than the aimless drifting that had become her life. William stopped in front of a closed door painted white with small purple flowers stenciled around the frame. Clearly, Catherine's work, a mother's touch that lingered even after she was gone. He knocked softly, and there was no answer, just silence thick enough to choke on. And he opened the door anyway, revealing a large, bright room with 2 small beds covered in patchwork quilts and a window seat piled with cushions where 2 thin figures sat pressed together like birds in a storm. Mary, Beth, William said, his voice gentle in a way that made Evangeline's heart ache. This is Miss Evangeline. She's going to be staying with us, helping take care of the house and spending time with you. The girls didn't move, didn't even look at him. Their faces turned toward the window, though Evangeline doubted they were seeing anything beyond the glass. And she got her first real look at them, Mary, tall and dark-haired like her father, with eyes that held too much understanding, and Beth, small and golden like her mother must have been, both of them pale as milk and thin enough that their bones showed sharp beneath their skin. "Hello?" Evangeline said softly, not moving into the room, knowing instinctively that pushing forward would be a mistake. "I'm pleased to meet you both. Your father has told me about you." Nothing. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement, and William's face tightened with frustration and pain. But Evangeline just stood there, remembering how it felt to be so lost in grief that other people seemed like creatures from another world. Their voices, meaningless noise, their presence an intrusion on the private work of falling apart. "I'll let you rest," she said finally, backing out of the doorway. "But I'll be here if you need anything. I'm not going anywhere." As William closed the door, she caught a glimpse of movement, Mary's head turning just slightly, just enough to look at her with those two old eyes. An assessment being made, a judgment being formed. And then the door clicked shut, and Evangeline was standing in the hallway of a stranger's house with a contract signed and a promise made and absolutely no idea if she could keep it. But she knew with a certainty that went bone deep that she would try, because these children needed her, and she needed them, and sometimes survival meant holding onto someone else's hand while you both climbed out of the dark. William showed Evangeline to her room, third door down the hall from the girls, and when he opened it, she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself because it was bigger than the entire wagon she'd shared with her family. With a real bed that had a carved headboard and a thick mattress, a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher painted with roses, a wardrobe that stood empty and waiting, and a window that looked out over the ranch lands stretching gold and green toward mountains that seemed to touch the sky. It was Catherine's sewing room, William said quietly, and Evangeline could see traces of the woman who'd lived here in the neat shelves still holding spools of thread organized by color, the basket beside the rocking chair still containing a half-finished embroidery hoop, a pastoral scene with a house and children playing that would never be completed. "You can clear out anything you don't want," he continued. But Evangeline shook her head because touching another woman's belongings felt like desecration, like she was already trying to erase Catherine when her whole purpose here was to help the children remember that love could exist after loss. "I'll leave it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And William nodded with something like relief in his expression, as if he'd been testing her and she'd passed. He left her alone then, said dinner would be at 6 and that she should rest, make herself at home. And the moment the door closed behind him, Evangeline stood in the center of that beautiful room and felt like an imposter, a ragged crow that had flown in through an open window and was pretending to be a songbird. She washed her face and hands in the basin, the water clean and cool, and watched the dirt swirl away down the drain, weeks of dust and desperation circling and disappearing. And she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand, a stranger's face, all sharp angles and sunburned skin, eyes that had seen too much, and hair that hung lank and lifeless despite her attempt to pin it up. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd been surviving instead of living, and she wondered what those two silent girls saw when they looked at her, whether they recognized a fellow ghost or just saw another adult who would inevitably fail them. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, and Evangeline sat in the rocking chair by the window, watching ranch hands move across the yard below, watching the sun crawl across the floor, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, the creak of floorboards and the tick of that grandfather clock, and once, just once, the soft pad of small feet in the hallway outside her door, stopping, waiting, then moving away. She didn't open the door, didn't call out, because she understood that the girls needed to investigate her on their own terms, needed to decide for themselves whether she was a threat or an ally or just another temporary presence that would drift through their lives and disappear. At 6 o'clock, she made her way downstairs, following the sound of clattering dishes to a dining room that was far too grand for the sad little scene it contained. A long table that could seat 12 set with only 4 places, fine china that gleamed white in the lamplight, and William already seated at the head looking uncomfortable in his own house. "They'll be down," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. And sure enough, several minutes passed before Evangeline heard those soft footsteps on the stairs, slow and reluctant. And then the girls appeared in the doorway like twin wraiths, Mary's hand gripping Beth so tightly her knuckles were white. They moved to their seats across from Evangeline without looking at her, without looking at anything really, their eyes fixed on some middle distance that only they could see. And when William's housekeeper, an older Mexican woman named Rosa who'd stayed on to cook because she'd loved Catherine, brought out platters of roasted chicken and potatoes and fresh bread, the smell was enough to make Evangeline's empty stomach cramp with hunger. But the girls didn't react at all. "It looks wonderful, Rosa," William said with forced cheerfulness, and he began serving the plates, putting generous portions in front of each daughter. And Evangeline watched Mary stare at her food like it was something foreign and incomprehensible, while Beth simply picked up her fork and set it down again, a mechanical gesture that meant nothing. The meal was agony, William trying to make conversation about the ranch, about the weather, about anything that might penetrate the silence, while Evangeline pushed food around her plate and tried not to eat too quickly, tried not to show how desperately hungry she was because that felt somehow shameful in front of these children who couldn't eat at all. Mary took 3 bites, slow and deliberate, chewing each one for so long. Evangeline thought she might be trying to make the food disappear through sheer force of will. And Beth didn't eat anything, just sat with her hands folded in her lap and her head bowed like she was praying or perhaps just wishing she could disappear. "Beth, sweetheart, you need to eat something," William said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, and the little girl flinched but didn't respond. Didn't even acknowledge that he'd spoken, and Evangeline saw his jaw clench, saw the helpless rage of a man who could control everything in his world except the thing that mattered most. She wanted to say something, wanted to help, but what wisdom could she offer when her own children were dead and she'd failed to save them? When she'd watched helpless while they slipped away and all her love and desperation couldn't keep them breathing. So she stayed silent too, just another ghost at a table full of ghosts. And when Rosa came to clear the plates, she looked at the uneaten food with an expression of such profound sadness that Evangeline had to look away. After dinner, William retreated to his study, and the girls drifted upstairs like smoke, and Evangeline found herself alone in the vast parlor, sitting on a sofa that was too soft after months of sleeping on the ground, surrounded by wealth that meant nothing in the face of grief. She thought about going to her room, but the idea of lying in that big bed with nothing but her own thoughts for company was unbearable. So she stayed where she was, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun set, and the house settled into night. And she must have dozed because she woke suddenly to the sound of crying, thin and broken and trying so hard to be quiet. It was coming from upstairs, from the direction of the girls' room, and Evangeline stood before she'd fully thought through what she was doing, her feet carrying her to the base of the stairs where she stood frozen, her hand on the banister, listening to a child's grief pour out in the darkness. Every instinct screamed at her to go up there, to knock on that door, to offer comfort even if it was rejected. But she remembered Mary's assessing eyes and Beth's flinch at her father's voice, and she understood that these children had been invaded by well-meaning adults before, had been poked and prodded and forced to perform grief in acceptable ways. And maybe what they needed was not another person pushing into their space, but someone who would simply be present, who would hear their pain and not demand that they perform healing for anyone's benefit but their own. So she sat down on the stairs, right there in the hallway, and she listened to the crying. It was Beth, she thought. The sounds young and frightened in a way that Mary's grief would be too controlled to express, and she stayed there in the dark, bearing witness to pain she couldn't fix. And after what felt like hours, the crying finally quieted, replaced by the murmur of Mary's voice, too low to make out words but clearly offering comfort the way an 8-year-old would, taking on responsibilities no child should have to carry. Evangeline heard movement in the room, the creak of a bed, and then silence, and she stayed on the stairs a while longer, thinking about Sarah comforting Thomas when he'd had nightmares, how she'd sung to him in a voice that was off-key but full of love. And the memory was a knife between her ribs but also somehow a comfort because at least it meant they'd been real. Her children had existed and loved each other, and that mattered even if they were gone. Eventually she made her way back to her own room, past the girls' closed door with its painted flowers, and she lay down on that impossibly soft bed, still fully dressed because undressing felt too presumptuous. too much like she actually belonged here. And she stared at the ceiling and wondered what she'd gotten herself into, whether she had anything to offer these broken children when she was so thoroughly broken herself. Sleep came eventually, thin and fractured, and she dreamed of Sarah and Thomas, but also of two girls she barely knew, of hollow eyes and silent mouths. And when she woke before dawn to the sound of roosters and ranch hands starting their day, she understood with a clarity that surprised her that this was going to be the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than burying her family, harder than walking away from their graves. Because this required not just surviving but actually living again, actually opening herself up to love and loss and all the terrifying possibilities that came with caring about someone else's pain. And she wasn't sure she was strong enough. Wasn't sure anyone was strong enough. But she'd signed her name on that contract and made a promise. And if there was one thing Evangeline Rose Morrison still believed in, it was keeping her word. Especially when it cost her everything she had left to give. 6 months had transformed the Thornwood house from a mausoleum into a home, and Evangeline sometimes had to stop in doorways just to listen to the sound of Mary's laughter drifting from the parlor where she was teaching Beth to play checkers, or the thunder of small feet racing down the hallway, or the simple everyday noise of a family that had learned how to live again. The girls had filled out, their cheeks round and rosy, their eyes bright with the particular mischief of children who felt safe enough to test boundaries. And Beth talked now, a constant stream of observations and questions that made up for all those months of silence. While Mary had discovered a love of reading and could usually be found curled up in the window seat with whatever book she'd claimed from William's library. Evangeline had filled out too, her hollow cheeks softening, her hands no longer quite so raw, her dresses new ones that William had insisted on buying, saying she couldn't care for his daughters, while dressed in rags actually fitting properly, instead of hanging on her frame like funeral shrouds. She had become essential to the rhythm of the house, waking before dawn to help Rosa with breakfast, spending mornings with the girls on their lessons because William had hired no governess, trusting Evangeline to teach them reading and arithmetic and history. Afternoons devoted to whatever adventures the girls dreamed up, whether that was helping in the garden or visiting the new foals in the barn, or simply lying in the grass making up stories about the shapes of clouds. But there was something else growing in the house too, something unspoken that crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. And it lived in the moments when William's hand would brush hers as he passed her the coffee pot at breakfast, in the way his gaze would linger on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, in how she had become acutely aware of his presence in every room, the sound of his boots on the porch sending her heart into an unsteady rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a longing she'd thought died with John. The girls had noticed children always did, and Evangeline had caught them whispering and giggling, had seen the way Mary's eyes would dart between her and William during dinner with a calculating expression that was far too knowing for an 8-year-old, had heard Beth ask her father in a voice loud enough to carry why he didn't marry Miss Evangeline, since she was already like a mama, and then they could be a real family forever. William had stammered something about it being complicated and changed the subject. But Evangeline had seen the color rise in his neck, had felt her own cheeks burn, and the moment had hung between them like a question neither dared to answer. One evening in late autumn, when the girls were already asleep and the house was settling into its nighttime quiet, Evangeline was in the kitchen putting away the last of the dinner dishes when William came in, ostensibly for another cup of coffee, but really she could tell by the tension in his shoulders because he had something to say. He poured the coffee but didn't drink it, just stood there holding the cup and staring into it like it held answers. And finally he said, "You've done so much for us, for the girls. They're completely different children than they were 6 months ago, and I just want you to know that I see it. I'm grateful for it." The words were careful, formal, the kind of thing an employer might say to a valued employee, and Evangeline felt something crack in her chest because, was that all this was to him? A successful business arrangement? A contract fulfilled? "They're easy to love," she said quietly, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, and William made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been something else entirely. "Evangeline, he started, then stopped, setting the cup down with a sharp click of porcelain on wood. And when she turned to look at him, his expression was tortured, like a man at war with himself. "I want you to know that you're free here, that you don't owe me anything beyond what we agreed to. And if you ever wanted to leave, to find your own life somewhere else, I wouldn't. I would never. But he couldn't seem to finish the sentence, couldn't seem to say whatever it was he'd come to say. And the moment stretched and broke, and he left the kitchen without another word, leaving Evangeline standing there with her heart in her throat and tears burning behind her eyes because she'd thought, she'd hoped, but apparently she'd been wrong about what those lingering looks and careful touches meant. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by the weekly mail rider, and William brought it to her where she was braiding Beth's hair in the parlor, his face carefully neutral as he handed her the envelope with her name written in an unfamiliar hand. It was from a cousin she barely remembered, her father's brother's son who'd moved to Philadelphia years ago, and the letter explained in precise, lawyerly language that he'd been searching for her since hearing about the cholera outbreak that had taken her family, that her maternal grandmother had passed away 6 months ago and left Evangeline a small inheritance, a house in Philadelphia, and enough money to live modestly but independently for the rest of her life, and he was inviting her to come east, to claim what was hers, to start fresh somewhere civilized where she could rebuild her life properly. Evangeline read it twice, the words blurring together, while Beth chattered about something unimportant and Mary watched her with those two perceptive eyes. And when William asked if everything was all right, she could only nod because her voice had abandoned her entirely. That evening at dinner, William said, with a forced casualness that fooled no one, "That's quite an opportunity. The inheritance. A fresh start in a real city. You should go. You should take it." The girls went silent, their forks clattering to their plates, and Mary said no, with such fierce conviction that it should have been funny, except nothing about this was funny. "Papa, you can't let her go," Beth added, her voice climbing toward panic. "You can't. She's ours. She belongs here." But William just shook his head and said something about how Evangeline had her own life to live, how she'd done what she came here to do and now she deserved to be free. And Evangeline heard what he wasn't saying, that he was releasing her from obligation, that he thought she'd only stayed out of gratitude or necessity, that he didn't understand she would have stayed forever if only he'd asked her to, if only he'd given her any sign that she was more to him than just a solution to his problem. The next week was agony, Evangeline making preparations she didn't want to make, packing belongings she didn't want to take, while the girls followed her around like grieving shadows, and William became distant and formal, conducting their interactions like business meetings, discussing travel arrangements and the transfer of her final wages with the emotional investment of a banker. Mary stopped smiling, stopped reading, spent her days glaring at her father with betrayed fury, while Beth regressed, becoming quiet and clingy, her hard-won words drying up until she communicated mostly in headshakes and desperate hugs. Rosa muttered in Spanish about foolish, stubborn men and told Evangeline that she was making a mistake, that anyone with eyes could see how the patron looked at her. But Evangeline couldn't see it anymore, couldn't see anything beyond the careful way William avoided being alone with her, the way he'd look through her instead of at her, and she convinced herself that she'd imagined everything, that the attraction had been one-sided, that she was just the hired help and had been stupid enough to forget it. The night before she was scheduled to leave, Evangeline couldn't sleep, couldn't bear the thought of lying in that room for one last time. So she went downstairs to the kitchen where she'd spent so many early mornings with Rosa, where she'd taught Beth to crack eggs and listened to Mary practice her reading, and she sat at the scarred wooden table and finally let herself fall apart, great gasping sobs that she muffled against her arms because she didn't want to wake anyone, didn't want them to see how completely she was breaking. She didn't hear William come in, didn't know he was there until his hand was on her shoulder, warm and solid. And when she looked up, his face was devastated, like her pain was his pain, and he dropped to his knees beside her chair and said, "Don't cry, please don't cry. If you want to go, I'll let you go. I won't make you stay somewhere you don't want to be." "Want?" She choked out, the word half laugh and half sob. "You think I want to leave? You think I want to go to Philadelphia and live alone in some dead woman's house and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if you'd given me any reason to?" But she couldn't finish because he was staring at her like she'd just said something in a foreign language, his eyes wide with shock and dawning understanding. "I love you," he said, the words rough and urgent like they'd been torn out of him. "I love you, not because you saved my daughters, not because you made my house a home again, but because you're you, Because you're strong and stubborn and you make me laugh and you see me, really see me. Not just the money or the ranch, but the man underneath. And I've been dying these past months watching you and wanting you and not saying anything because I didn't want to trap you. Didn't want you to stay out of obligation or gratitude. I wanted you to be free to choose. And if you choose Philadelphia, then I'll let you go even though it will kill me. But if there's any chance, any possibility that you might choose me instead. She kissed him, cutting off the desperate flow of words, her hands fisting in his shirt and pulling him closer. And it was nothing like the careful kisses she'd shared with John, sweet and appropriate and mapped out by propriety. This was fierce and hungry, and tasted like salt from her tears, and held 6 months of longing and fear and hope. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, his forehead pressed against hers, and he said, "Is that a yes?" She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You haven't asked me a question yet, William Thornwood." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her want to weep all over again. And he said, "Evangeline Rose Morrison, will you marry me? Not because my daughters need a mother, not because I'm offering you security or a home, but because I love you and I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and know that you chose to be there. Will you stay not because you have to, but because you want to?" "Yes," she said, the word simple and clear and sure. "Yes, I'll stay. I choose you. I choose this. I choose us." The sound of small feet on the stairs made them both look up to find Mary and Beth standing in the kitchen doorway in their nightgowns, Mary grinning with smug satisfaction while Beth bounced on her toes with excitement. And when Evangeline asked how long they'd been listening, Mary just shrugged and said, "Long enough to know we're going to be a real family now." And Beth launched herself at them, followed quickly by Mary, and they all ended up in a tangle on the kitchen floor, laughing and crying and holding on to each other like they'd never let go. The wedding was small, just family and the ranch hands and a few people from town, held in the parlor with Rosa weeping happily in the corner, and the girls serving as flower girls in matching yellow dresses. And when the circuit judge pronounced them married, William kissed her in front of everyone, with an enthusiasm that made Mary groan and Beth giggle, and made Evangeline feel like she was finally, actually, completely home. That evening they sat down to dinner, the four of them, a family now legally and completely, and Beth chattered about wedding cake while Mary drew elaborate plans for how they should rearrange the house, and William's hand found Evangeline's under the table, his thumb rubbing gentle circles against her palm, and she looked around at these people who had become hers, who she had chosen and who had chosen her back, and she thought about the woman who had stood at the gate 6 months ago, desperate and hollow and barely surviving, and she understood now that sometimes salvation wasn't about being rescued, but about finding people to save together, about holding on to each other while you all climbed out of the dark. And as the last light faded from the Montana sky and the lamps cast their warm glow over the dinner table, Evangeline squeezed William's hand and smiled at her daughters because they were hers now, legally and completely, and she knew with a certainty that went bone deep that this was what coming home felt like. Not a place, but people. Not security, but choice. Not just surviving, but actually, finally, joyfully living again.